been my joy to work with her, and she has been a wonderful president and leader for PAMLA and its members. I want to share a few words from her dean at Fresno, Dr. Nora Chapman. She writes that she has been lucky to work for almost 2 decades with Yolanda. While reviewing her teaching and peer evaluations, Dean Chapman mentions that Yolanda brings a joyful spirit to all her classes. We too at PAMLA have witnessed this joyful spirit at every meeting. There's never a meeting without Yolanda cracking that beautiful smile or saying something that makes us all just laugh. Her humor, her kindness, and willingness to help others are key features of her leadership. The staff members at PAMLA also greatly appreciate her leadership and echo words from Nadine Navarro, Vice President of Latino Faculty Association staff at Fresno. Navarro writes, her steady and unwavering support for staff on this campus has been inspiring and refreshing, indicative of a true leader who understands and supports her staff. So I really admire also Yolanda and how she treats and approaches everybody in the same way, from the staff, from a VP, from a tenured faculty member. She talks to everybody with kindness and generosity. So I greatly appreciate that. I also want to share the words from her chair, Nadine Munoz. She uses the metaphor of a garden and how Yolanda is a wonderful gardener who is committed to nurturing and supporting growth. There was a lot of references to you having a wonderful garden and feeding people. I couldn't share all that in this introduction. It would be far too long. Dr. Munoz credits Yolanda with playing a key role in Munoz's transformation from a junior faculty member to a department chair. So she's also someone who helps others to succeed and reach their goals. She writes, I wouldn't have accepted the position if I didn't believe in Yolanda's unwavering support. She goes on to say how much she depends on Yolanda's advice. The leadership of PAMLA has also depended on Yolanda's thoughtful insights and guidance. She has made everybody's job easier. One of Yolanda's department colleagues says that students describe her as a ray of sunshine. Profesora Yolanda es el sol. That's pretty big. Like her students, we see her as a cheerful, encouraging, and brilliant colleague, and we are so grateful for her guidance and commitment to PAMLA.
Thank you so much, Juan. Thank you, Davida. It's a privilege to be here. I'm so grateful for all of you being here tonight and joining me. Greg may live to regret it, but he told me to pick a topic that was interesting to me, to do something that I wanted. So we'll see how it goes. I chose the topic of the act and the art of shifting perspectives. I'm going to be mentioning a lot of different fields somewhat quickly because I'm using them to illustrate my main point regarding the value and difficulty of shifting perspectives. Two rather disparate things inspired the theme for this year's conference and for this talk. The first and primary one is my love of Borges' penchant for forcefully shifting the reader's perspective. Like, for example, when he walks us through a first-person narrative by what appears to be a lonely, somewhat immature or fanciful individual, only to reveal to us at the end that it was the Minotaur sharing his point of view all along. Narratives such as Borges and I, Three Versions of Judas, The Circular Ruins, or Kafka and his Precursors, take us by the hand into unorthodox ways of looking at the writer, at religious dogma, at the sometimes blurry line between reality and dreams, essay and short story. The last one, Kafka and his Precursors, from 1951, links to and predates the major strands of reader response theory. I've written before that Borges, in many short stories over the years, emphasizes the importance not just of reading and readers, but especially of good critical any given moment in order to process what we call reality in a more efficient, timely manner, in order for us to function, basically. Selective attention, including a bias towards pattern recognition, actually helps keep us safe, and in many ways by focusing on the most likely threats, most likely details of importance, be they visual, auditory, olfactory, and so on. The issue is the quantity of false dichotomies that seemingly get accepted. Our profession gives us the opportunity to explore connections between seemingly unrelated things, making analogies. It is this interdisciplinary approach, the possibilities that go with it, that excite me. And my hope today is to share some of that enthusiasm. We make advances by looking at things in weird new ways. In literary theory, in math, in physics, in art, linguistics, and sometimes we get laughed at. But other times, the weird new perspectives might spark something and catch on. You don't know until you try. Sometimes it will be disproved and eventually discarded, and that's okay. Then other times it might start to come out that you're onto something. Unfortunately for Socrates, that last part came up too late. But it is through this willingness to entertain different perspectives, different ways of approaching an issue, that we at best make advances in our field and contributions to society. And at worst, perhaps enjoy a thought experiment. In between the extremes, we might even discover common ground with someone different from us. I would go a step further and say no harm comes from it, but of course, Socrates' fate might show otherwise, as would the Inquisition. Risks notwithstanding, and perhaps reading the room, which is a euphemism for performing a quick risk assessment, I would assert that making a habit of shifting perspectives can enrich our work, our relationships, our individual lives. Let's start with language. It's been posited that language essentially represents a different way of organizing reality, meaning it offers us a different perspective on the same experiences. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis takes two forms: that language determines thought, which has been pretty soundly refuted, or that language influences thought, which has been pretty well supported by repeated experiments. However, the weak version plausibly suggests that different languages can carve up the world in different ways. Or put another way, that conceptual thinking can be shaped and constrained by available linguistic categories. As Whorf puts it, we cut nature up, organize it into concepts, ascribe significance as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way. An agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns of our language. Colors would be one simple example, where the conceptual categories for colors are sometimes divided up differently from one language family to another. Imagine the implications for polyglots. How much more do you have at your disposal to pull from in interpreting and communicating your experience of reality when you're fluent in multiple languages with their corresponding worldviews? Furthermore, what happens in the brackish water of languages and cultures in contact? For example, in the context of the occasionally bilingual passages found in Chicano or Latinx literature, Lourdes Torres tells us an important contribution of these texts is that they continue to document the multilingual reality that exists in this country. Latino fictional texts are an example of a contact zone where English and Spanish confront each other and comfortably or uncomfortably coexist. This code switching, or so-called Spanglish, in this context, is another topic that often inspires dichotomous thinking, at least sociologically, with impacts in pedagogy. Borges mentions how Latinos who code switch are often judged as ignorant or lazy by educators, and even by other Latino community members who believe that languages should be kept separate. My grandmother definitely fell into that camp. It was puro inglés o puro español. Never the twain shall meet. This is something that we see frequently across the higher ed landscape as well. And in so doing, it isolates students from a rich wealth of bilingual literature. For example, Spanish programs typically, traditionally offer little to none of the rich bilingual narrative, drama, or poetry available. What that view misses is the nuance and value of sociolinguistic identities. Our fields tend to be siloed, at least in traditional American universities. This gives us an opportunity to think more about how we might encourage interdisciplinary collaboration by keeping an eye open for connections and building on the common ground between our diverse fields. For example, how many of us here use theory or content from other fields to analyze literature? History, psychology, sociology, ethnic studies, women's studies, philosophy, linguistics, disability studies, education, music, even architecture. How many of us have borrowed from other disciplines when a literary text lends itself to that particular application? I've even seen a compelling application of the emerging field of video game theory applied to Juan Rulfo's haunting 1954 novel Pedro Páramo. Literary theory finds its roots in myriad places. Oh, and I forgot, I had a couple slides for you. So we got Borges, influence number one. We've got my view towards dichotomies. And we're moving into this one in just a moment. So moving back to dichotomies for a moment, if I may. In undergraduate classes, I often bring up La Conquista, the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. Specifically, that both sides at the time could describe the exact same events in radically different terms. One as a victory in terms of gain, gold, land, souls to convert to Christianity, fame. And the other as a profound tragedy, genocide, cultural loss, invasion, disease. And neither view is inaccurate. I use this in my Mexican culture classes as a rudimentary example of the importance of perspective, and specifically the value of making the effort to explore multiple perspectives on a given situation before we form a final opinion on the matter. In that same context, we can also look at La Malinche, the indigenous woman who served as a key translator for Hernán Cortés, helping him, among other things, overthrow the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma in the early 16th century. Her indigenous name was Malintzin. When she was gifted to the Spanish, they baptized her and named her Doña Marina. At some point in Spanish, her name became popularized as La Malinche. She spoke Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and Maya, and together with a male interpreter who spoke Maya and Spanish, she formed a key link in the chain of communication between Moctezuma and Cortés. More importantly, we can trace how her image has shifted and how each name for her connotes a different perspective towards her as a person. Malintzin is associated with a child who was betrayed by her mother, sold into slavery so that the mother could give the land and title that belonged to Malintzin to the girl's younger half-brother. Doña Marina, in turn, is associated with her image as the interpreter for Cortés. And Cortés' soldier, Bernal Díaz de Castillo, wrote effusively of her intelligence, beauty, kindness, and skill as an interpreter. Finally, in his 1950 exploration of Mexican identity, Labyrinth of Solitude, writer and public intellectual Octavio Paz refers to Malinche as the mother of mestizaje, given that she had what is considered to be the first recognized child, keyword recognized, of mixed indigenous and European blood. He notes that on the topic of Mexican identity, Mexicans at the time, 1950, were failing to acknowledge their dual heritage, not owning their Spanish or European past, nor their indigenous one, much less acknowledging themselves as mestizos, preferring instead a sort of non-identity. Malinche has been vilified as a traitor to her people. One valid perspective, but when combined with the other perspectives of her as betrayed daughter, valued interpreter, and symbolic, though scorned, mother of modern Mexico, we can better appreciate the complexity of lived reality and survival choices, even in today's society. This brings us in turn to Peruvian sociologist Silvia Spita, her concept of the continuum of mestizaje around 1995, wherein individuals in Latin America are self-identified or described by others according to the dichotomy of either white or indigenous, when the large majority actually fell into the category of both, along a continuum between those two axes. Even as Latin American public intellectuals and politicians promoted the concept of mestizaje under the guise or justification of unity, a campaign which itself marginalized other Latin American identities such as Afro-Latinos, Asian Latinos, and Jewish Latinos, individual people still fell all too often along the poles, identifying or being identified as indigenous or white. Today, it is better recognized that contemporary identities go beyond a continuum between two poles, instead including multiple factors. And with the advent of DNA testing, companies like 23andMe and the plethora of families who've been doing that, hopefully it won't be long before perspectives shift more with regard to the concepts of race and otherness. Even talking about shifting perspectives away from dichotomies presents a sort of dichotomy: shift, no shift. But I'll come back to that. Right now, I'd like to explore a different connection related to our theme: the field of behavioral analysis in psychology. Has yielded some particularly helpful therapies in terms of not just coping strategies for challenging aspects of life, but actual basic skills for everyday use: emotional regulation, mindfulness, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. Cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy all include aspects of, and to some degree, were inspired by Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus in particular have been cited by Albert Ellis. So we've got Marcus Aurelius on the left and Albert Ellis on the right. They've been cited by Albert Ellis, the grandfather of what today are considered the family of cognitive behavioral type therapies. Ellis's quote that people are disturbed not by things, but by their view of things, crystallizes his view that philosophical factors are more important than psychoanalytic and psychodynamic factors in accounting for psychological disturbance. That is to say that a surprising amount of the time, shifting our perspective to either consider how others might view a situation or to measure how impactful the current crisis in our lives truly is in the big picture, or focusing on our own physiological responses to distress, among other strategies, actually can bring about a modicum of calm or acceptance to a situation we had previously considered vexing. Now, to be clear, this is not a replacement for stronger support if someone is experiencing a profound crisis or medical event. But it is a bit like losing the forest for the trees. We as humans can get caught up in the details of a situation. I'm sure I suspect this sounds somewhat familiar to many people out there. We can get caught up in the details of a situation to the point of feeling genuine distress about it. And by purposely stepping back to look at the bigger, often more objective picture, our new perspective can help us recover a modicum of objectivity. And we find ourselves better able to handle what is before us. Cites Epictetus, the task of a philosopher. We should bring our will into harmony with whatever happens, so that nothing happens against our will, and nothing that we wish for fails to happen. And the editor then adds, it might not seem like it makes a big difference to see life as something you have to do versus get to do. But there is a huge, magnificent difference. In other words, to quote Saturday Night Live, we're talking perspectives. Continuing in the sciences for a moment, I'd like to highlight two significant examples in the sciences of the value of being open or not to perspective shift. The first is the fact that heart attacks used to be thought of as presenting in one particular way across the board until the early 1990s, when it was finally discovered that the bodies of people assigned female at birth, in the bodies of people assigned female at birth, heart attacks very often presented differently than in men. Before that, studies were based on men, and in fact, until they were overturned in 1992, FDA regulations specifically they had the effect of excluding women with childbearing potential from clinical studies. That's a lot of women. So the research was done on men with the assumption that their bodies were analogous to the female bodies for things like heart disease and attacks. Similarly, and I should add currently, there appears to be growing evidence that autism spectrum disorder may occur more frequently than thought in people assigned female at birth. Once again, the set of child symptoms classically associated with autism was based on children assigned to male at birth. These examples illustrate how, by shifting perspectives, reevaluating what was once taken to be settled symptomatic and diagnostic criteria, science advances. And as a result, more people are able to receive meaningful assistance. Speaking of medical issues, let's talk about Frida Kahlo. Known as a surrealist artist and wife of Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, Kahlo was born in 1907 and came to be a recognized artist in the 30s in Mexico. Perhaps even more notably, she was a person who suffered a series of debilitating illnesses and injury. Polio as a child, which left her sickly, and a gruesome bus accident as a teenager in which a steel rail impaled her through the hip, fracturing her hip and pelvis. Throughout her 47-year life, she spent many months in casts and hospitals. And yet, Frida Kahlo was a figure who unapologetically forced us to look at her uncomfortable moments and how she adapted through her many self-portraits. In addition, she was bisexual and, by today's standards, possibly gender fluid in a time and culture when those things weren't particularly recognized for women. In the PBS documentary, The Life and Times of Frida Kahlo, the writer Carlos Monsiváis informs us that the most radical thing about Frida wasn't her sexuality, but rather her refusal to behave like a disabled person. Her gusto for life, sex with multiple partners and different genders, tequila, painting, smoking, teaching, traveling, did not conform to society's expectations for a good Mexican woman, much less a disabled one. Needless to say, she was ahead of her time. The field of disability studies, which started to come out in the 1980s, is one that actively advocates for societal perspective shifts in the form of reasonable accommodations and recognition of the fundamental personhood and rights of people with disabilities. Invisible disabilities seem to be a particular challenge for many in our dichotomy-addicted societies. There's no shortage of people who do not look disabled, reporting harassment for using mobility devices, disabled parking spots, service dogs, and other aids. What is not recognized is there is a spectrum for disability. It is not a dichotomy, deaf, hearing, blind, seeing, and so on. In a related vein, the neurodivergence movement, back to that one, the neurodivergence movement advocates for reframing diagnoses like autism and ADHD, shifting away from disability where possible and towards identity. The current predominant medical model focuses on deficits in individuals. In contrast, the neurodivergence movement is more focused on activism to recognize strengths. The neurodivergence movement thus pushes back against the normative pressure to mask and fit in, instead embracing the perspective that brains that are wired a little different aren't necessarily bad or less than or something that needs to be masked, but rather can be embraced and accommodated more easily into society with some fairly simple perspective shifts. Basically, and I suspect a lot of you may have noticed this, the connections across our disciplines are manifold and range from subtle to significant, not just between arts, humanities, and soft sciences, but also with STEM. Think of connections between engineering, architecture, and art and design, for example, form and function. And in the academy, the art of shifting perspectives is really more about broadening our perspectives to notice what is already there. These disciplines, like language, are ways of organizing and interacting with reality. Yes, we focus on our particular areas of expertise and interest, but the connections to the rest are there if and when we want to notice them. And when we take it a step further and start tracing those connections, well, that's where it gets interesting. Let's return to Borges for a moment. Oops. There we go. Let's return to him for a moment. Earlier I mentioned his emphasis on good critical thinking. In this way, Borges opens us to a mindful, critical, and creative practice of shifting our perspective, not just in literature and art. Indeed, he often turned his eyes to philosophy, theology, metaphysics, history, deftly blending them into literature and art on occasions, but also as an art and practice of reading reality. One of the things that draws me to Borges is the seemingly oxymoronic quality of openness, of the questioning of reality and popular versions of history and myths, from the Minotaur to the world religions to exploration of connections with other disciplines and deep intertextuality and delight in the play between and across texts, along with some fairly clear judgments or boundaries, such as when he has characters forego personal gain and professional development in the interest of exerting their principles, after an appropriately mystical epiphany, of course. Borges highlights the porosity of the line between reality and fiction or dreams. And in fact, Christopher Nolan credits the influence of Borges' stories for the film Inception. When I first started working on this address, my intent was to give diverse examples and then explain first how shifting perspectives is an act, and then how it is an art. Somewhere along the way, I started to realize that that division was not going to be as clear-cut as I had originally thought. As an act, shifting perspectives both transcends and connects disciplines, as with the application of literary theory. Individual literary theories tend to direct our attention to a particular focus, but taken as a whole, the field and evolution of literary theory exemplifies both the act and the art of shifting perspectives. Applied theory is the act, and developing a theory is the art. The rather stodgy dichotomy of high culture and low or mass culture has been subverted by prestige, for example, which then puts into question the categories of taste and trends. More than dichotomy or continuum much like how Borges shows us there's a linea borrosa between reality and dreams or fiction, I realized that there's a similarly porous line between the act and the art of shifting perspectives. So for example, if we look at literary theory versus the application of theory to literary work, there's a false dichotomy of sorts, in that sometimes a deft application can surprise and delight much as a work of art. Theory is the art, application is the act, but these fuse, too. In Borgesian fashion, act and art are often distinguished by a very porous line indeed. Let's return briefly to translation, specifically as an art, and more specifically as a stellar example of the art of shifting perspectives. I talked about this a little in my introduction to translator and musician Adriana Martin Moore's welcome event Wednesday night. Translation is an art. What I mean by this is that there is rarely a one-to-one relationship between words and concepts in one language and words and concepts in another. So a good translator has to not only find the closest concept in the second language, but also to attempt to capture the spirit, the context, the feel, and the register of the first language. As you may have noticed in your own fields, different translations present different perspectives, anywhere from subtle differences to rather significant ones. Borges, having grown up with an English grandmother and an enviable library full of great texts, classic texts in English, also did impressive translation work, translating Joyce's Ulysses into Spanish, for example, as well as work from Spanish to English. I'm given to understand that as a translator, he focused on getting the essence of the work. That's a key part of it, of the art of translation. Similarly, critical thinking exemplifies both the act and art of shifting perspectives. Through a willingness to look at multiple sides of an issue and then analyze it, you can't think critically without shifting perspectives. You have to be motivated to shift perspectives. I dare say you cannot not shift perspectives if you're motivated to be a rational, critical thinker. The art is knowing when to sift out data and when to sift it in. This also relates to how the arts and sciences are connected to and fuel each other. Exploring and then explaining what is important and why. These are key skills that we learn, practice, and train our students to master in the humanities. Through analyzing literature, questioning reality, connecting fields. How do we shift perspectives? Through reflection, analysis, and perhaps adaptation to new information or circumstances. Critical thinking can be defined as the analysis of available facts, evidence, observations, and arguments in order to form a judgment by the application of rational, skeptical, and unbiased analyses and evaluation. Now, it's hard to be completely unbiased. So we try to compensate by purposefully seeking out multiple views, angles, or versions of a story to help us better appreciate the details before coming to our own conclusions, like in the previous example of La Malinche. Sometimes the simple question, why, can be an invitation to a new view, perhaps a view that can be productive, illuminating, at the very least, interesting, and worth taking a moment to consider. In short, we connect with others by shifting perspectives. This openness to looking at other points of view, or even to actually bridging the gap between disparate points of view, is key to moving away from dichotomies. Learning another language, and more than one, opens us to new perspectives by forcing us to shift, even if slightly, our view of reality every time we switch to the new language. Learning about other cultures similarly invites us to shift our perspectives on reality, even if ever so slightly. In either case, we are not obliged to change our worldviews. Rather, we are afforded a new view. Like getting an upgraded hotel room with a better view of the mountains, for example. It is entirely our choice if we want to adopt, incorporate, or decline the new perspective and worldview. Basically, today I've offered a series of examples of perspective shifts that took, and in so doing, changed the way we think about those things. And the beautiful thing is, if you want, you can always shift your perspective back. Borges wrote en La Esfera de Pascal, quizá la historia universal es la historia de la diversa entonación de algunas metáforas. Perhaps universal history is the history of the varied intonation of a few metaphors. Well, historically, perhaps the art of shifting perspectives begins with the act of resisting dichotomies. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think before we open it up to questions, I think Peter has something to give you. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Yolanda for all her work and her enthusiasm, for her inspiration. She's really been, like you said, a son of the sun. And so we brought her a gift. Well, of course, a PAMLA gift is a t-shirt, a card, but a very carefully thought out book about Borges and Marta, his wife, to help give a souvenir of Portland other than this talk, which was so inspiring.
So we're open for questions. I have the mic. I can go down. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? Run over. Someone raise their hand. Questions? Yeah, over here. Give me a minute.
I just wondered if you could go to the painting by Frida Kahlo and just do a spontaneous analysis of the shifting perspectives here, because I see the able-bodied and the disabled body, but also I see the indigenous and Spanish, that kind of shifting of the mestizaje. So would you do a little interpretation there?
I can give it my best shot, and thank you so much for the question. I wanted to spend more time talking about Las Dos Fridas. So this is one of her famous self-portraits. She called it Las Dos Fridas, the two Fridas. And in that documentary I mentioned, this is what you get for late night watching public television. I saw this great documentary on her, liked it so much I bought it and showed it in my class every semester. But apparently, in one of the letters that she wrote to someone, she described Las Dos Fridas as, it was a painting she did during a moment of depression, during one of the many moments of crisis between her and Diego Rivera, and it described, it more than described, portrays how she feels. There's the Frida that she presents for Diego, which is much more feminine and put together, I guess, and then there's the Frida that she feels to be. All of the things that you stated, European, indigenous, disability, able-bodied, I agree with. I also see a bit of the masking in terms of gender identity. She's got other portraits, both photographs as well as self-portraits, where you see her in more, what we would consider more male-oriented attire. And it's just, she's the same Frida. This actually reminds me of Borges and I. project onto us, their interpretation of us, and then there's who we are for ourselves, what we carry inside of us, who our real self is, and it doesn't matter whether she looks able-bodied or not. It doesn't matter if she's dressed in very feminine, traditional Mexican attire or dressed in a men's suit. She's the same person on the inside. I don't know if that addresses you. Thank you.
So thank you for such a lovely address, and it's been a lovely experience working with you this year, and we'll get to work together next year. But I've always theorized that it is a dual perspective or double consciousness, like Du Bois would say, that often makes for the best writers or creators. Now, of course there are people who don't seem to have the dual vision that Du Bois talked about, who are great writers, so I don't know how they got it. It does seem often, it's like, my favorite writers and poets and artists are often people who are in between cultures, or seeing the culture from inside and outside. Like, well, I don't need to name them. Do you think that does, while, we don't want to overgeneralize about that, do you think that does create, it helps people to create better poetry or better art? And why? I mean, if that is the case, why does that at least give them the ability to write the things that I think move us the most or make us think the most? So I'm thinking more from the Du Bois double consciousness side of it, but I think yours is very interesting coming from these other perspectives. So do you think that's true, or am I just generalizing, saying my favorite poets are Black, Jewish, homosexual, transgender, Latinas, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah.
That's an awesome question. I don't know if it's true objectively. I can tell you that for personal reasons, I tend to gravitate towards those type of artists because feeling between cultures myself. So this is just personal. Feeling between cultures myself, appreciating the Latino side of my family and the white parts of my family. It's just something that I always end up gravitating towards. When I see art like this painting of Frida's, and when I read poetry or novels that grapple with those issues, it's easier for me to identify with it. Even when it's not a culture that's mine, it's still that experience of sort of feeling in limbo or being inside and outside, or sometimes being able to shift from one to the other. So it's like, okay, I'm going to be the bridge between, sometimes we'll see that expressed in works of art, where someone is a bridge kind of going back and forth or a go-between. And all of those are fascinating to me. So, larger answer, I don't know, but on a personal level, heck yeah.
Any other questions out there? Am I missing something? Yeah.
I know with the video team, but the presentation was absolutely enlightening. Thank you. I am from Venezuela originally. My father's side of the family was from Serbia, and even though I never been to Serbia, so I always felt like there was almost like a spirit that throughout my life was kind of like influencing me. But then I moved to the United States, and then I started to get immersed in another complete culture and everything. I started seeing that, using my empathy, people from the U.S. kind of like experience reality through a different lens that the way that I experienced it. So that was very felt it very close to my experience. However, I met a person not long ago who discovered through 21andMe, the DNA test, that she had heritage from Puerto Rico and a substantial part, and she felt that she was Italian. see something like almost like a spirit that, you know, like through the future when people are second and third and fourth generation in another place, like that feeling will still be something that people experience. Yeah, question.
I love this question. Thank you. Thank you so much. I love this question because immediately listening to you, it reminds me of mi tía Mita, my great aunt, Salvadoran, and she used to say to me, Yolandita, la sangre llama, saying your blood calls to you. I don't know if it's true or not. So again, objectively, I don't know. That's above my pay grade. On a cultural level, I was certainly raised to value that it doesn't matter if it's una gotita, if it's just a little bit, or if it's half or three-quarters. There's that something there. Moving away from it, trying to address it in an objective sense, I do think culturally, I love. I'm going back to the tapestry analogy because that's working for me today. It's what I've got on the brain. I love the idea of us weaving these tapestries, of thinking of our heritage as complex. It's not an either or. And it even goes beyond the why not both, because I love that why not both meme. That is absolutely my favorite meme out there. But it's just this complex mixture and how they interact. And then what do you do if you're from a mixed background where it's cultures that, traditionally hate each other, right? What do you do with that? Well, if that's your heritage, you gotta deal with it, right? I mean, what do you do with it? You move forward. You live your experience. You be present to what you can learn from it. And I mean, it all keeps going back to the shifting perspectives. We can make a great drinking game. How many times have I said perspectives tonight? Sorry about that. But it's hard to get away from that in my mind, because our brain, as human beings, our brains seem to want to simplify things. So we can have nice little categories and organize things and, make order of a potentially chaotic world. But the world doesn't necessarily want to go along with what our brains do. The world, whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, it's very complex. And I've decided to lean in and try to see how many different viewpoints I can try to at least appreciate. Even if I don't agree, I can just try and appreciate more viewpoints. I don't know if that responds. You're welcome.
I guess I have a question. See if I can articulate it. When you're talking about shifting perspectives and how you say one of the qualities is connecting to others, and one of the things when that came up, is this idea of, Borges also do the idea that maybe it's shifting perspectives. It's not so much like you get to A and B, you get to the second perspective or the other perspective, that you're always in a transitional state, that you're always maybe never quite, that shifting perspectives is a state of mind that you never quite get there, and it's so difficult sometimes, it's so turbulent, but it's a space that she says is for incredible growth, right? So there's a sense of you're between the borders, right? Do you have that sense of that shifting perspectives is a kind of a way of being?
It's the journey. It's the journey. It's not the destination so much as the journey. What are we experiencing? What are we learning? We got blown off the course. All right, well, what do we have here? Hey, there's mango here. Cool. I love that. That's a really good way of putting it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, gracias. Oh, there is over here. Oh, I should have brought my sneakers.
Languages. I'm curious to know what languages besides the two obvious Borges tried to acquire. He's not here, but you are. What languages have you explored? And did you find a language that was very famous, was trilingual. He spoke his native Oscan, which is an Italic dialect, or an Italic language, really not very close to Latin at all, Greek, and Latin. And he is reputed to have said another language, second language, altera, is another soul. And that often is, I think, understood too simply, because the word that he would have used in Latin or in Greek indicates another life. It's not just whatever the soul is detached, but it's a whole way of living that is, well, embodied, intoned, inspirited. What is your experience in learning languages besides the two that you obviously grew up with?
Thank you. So I have, there are four total. The English, I'm a heritage speaker of Spanish, meaning in my case, that's a continuum too. I grew up hearing it. I didn't speak a lot. I heard it, I understood. I get frustrated at not being able to express myself in all the weird words that I use in English, so I end up switching back to English to answer my family for a while, until I finally decided, I need to develop fluency. I respect my grandmother who learned English fluently. But I digress. There's also French. I have I think reasonably good listening and reading comprehension in French. My speech is so-so. Portuguese, it's more reading. I would love to explore Italian, and especially Wednesday night's event with Adrià Martí-Moore, talking about Catalan, Sardinian, and marginalized languages in danger of disappearing. It reminded me, my great-grandmother, Mercedes Paredes, spoke Maya Quiche, or one of the dialects of Maya Quiche, and I know that there are still speakers out there. I know that there are dictionaries. I got one when I was exploring the Yucatan Peninsula. So in a perfect world, I'd like to go down that path. Might be a struggle, but a worthwhile one, I think. So yeah, there are so many languages, so many connections between fields, and it feels like there's never enough time. Going back to being an undergrad, actually